So now if you're convinced in the necessity and the importance of doing mixed method studies, let's now take a look at some strategies that we can use to combine quantitative and qualitative data, and at some names, some labels that we can use to actually describe our mixed method research designs. This language and this classification comes mainly from the work of John Creswell, who is a methodologist in the field of mixed methods. And in his early work, he proposed different strategies for combining quantitative and qualitative data. One strategy is called merging the data. Merging the data is basically when you collect qualitative and quantitative data more or less simultaneously, and you analyze them independently, and then at the level of interpretation, at the level of results, you combine these findings and you kind of generalize upon them. The second strategy is connecting the data. It's a sequential strategy when you collect some qualitative data first, for example, and then you use the results in order to inform a subsequent quantitative study. So, and then based on this subsequent study, you arrive at some results. So essentially, qualitative study in this case is kind of a precursor, is a foundation for your following quantitative study. And of course, the sequence quantitative, qualitative can be different depending on your research aims. And the third strategy is embedding the data. What does embedding the data mean? It means that one paradigm in your study is dominant. In this case, the rectangle outside is labeled quantitative data, which means that quantitative paradigm is dominant. It means that we use quantitative analysis to arrive at our main results. But also within this study, we have embedded a qualitative component. For example, you're collecting the data mainly using some kind of psychometric questionnaires, but you've also included some open-ended questions to capture some information that the questionnaires don't really measure, or to get more context. But what does embedding means? Embedding means that you actually convert this qualitative data from these open-ended questions into a quantitative form. For example, you do a content analysis and you transform the verbal formulations into numeric results. For example, you code the themes present in each answer, and as a result, you get a matrix of scores which you can use in SPSS, for example. And basically, you have embedded qualitative data, but you have converted it into a quantitative form, and quantitative paradigm is dominant because you arrive at your main results using quantitative methodology. So merging simultaneously, or connecting sequentially, or embedding when the two paradigms have different status. In principle, qualitative paradigm can also be dominant if you complement your interview study with some questionnaires, and then you use scores from these questionnaires in order to enrich the psychological portraits of your participants. This is also possible. And in their more recent work, Creswell and Creswell propose also some research designs that are potentially more specific. This merging strategy is now called convergent design, or one-phase design, when you collect more or less simultaneously quantitative data and qualitative data, and you merge them at the level of results. So you analyze them pretty much at the same time, and you combine and connect the findings. So this is called a one-phase design because there is only one phase of result interpretation. The second design shown on this slide is called explanatory sequential design, or two-phase design. In this design, first you have a quantitative data collection and analysis phase, when, for example, you conduct a quantitative study in an organization. For example, you measure engagement and burnout, and you see that some employees are working in some job positions have completely particular profiles of engagement and burnout. For example, people doing certain kinds of jobs tend to burn out more easily. But then you might ask a question: what is special about those jobs that makes people burn out? And then you can actually, based on the results of this quantitative first series, you can formulate research questions for a qualitative data collection and analysis. And you might actually go and do some interviews with people working in these particular positions where they are at higher risk for burnout, in order to identify what are the characteristics of the job that actually make it so stressful or so demanding. And then, as a result, your conclusions are based on not only on quantitative or qualitative data, but you again connect the results and you show how your qualitative data explain what you have obtained using psychometric measures. That's why it's used explanatory sequential design. First you measure something, and then in order to understand it, you go and collect some qualitative data. A third design, which is also very typical in psychology, is a three-phase design, and it's called exploratory sequential design. It begins with a qualitative data collection and analysis, and then at phase 2, based on the results of this qualitative data collection and analysis, we develop some kind of new instrument or new experimental paradigm, or we identify a new variable. And then at the third phase, we conduct a quantitative study in order to actually test this new feature that we have developed. For example, when my colleague Ilona Bonival was interested in what it is that makes people satisfied with their use of time, what it is that makes a feeling of time well spent, and she wanted to identify this new construct, satisfaction with time use. And she started with a qualitative series. She did a series of interviews with people who were particularly satisfied and particularly dissatisfied with their use of time. And based on interpretive phenomenological analysis, she has managed to identify some themes present in those interviews that could potentially explain what are the processes and what are the variables that contribute to this satisfaction with time use. And then based on this interview study, she has developed a model, she has created a questionnaire, and then we did some studies together to actually test this questionnaire, test this model, how it inscribes into a larger nomological network of variables like time perspective, temporal satisfaction, and so on. So this is exploratory sequential design. And this is often the case when we develop, for example, a new questionnaire. We start with some kind of interview because we don't know what kind of questions are we supposed to ask our participants. And sometimes qualitative data can be used to complement an experimental procedure. And sometimes a qualitative series precedes an experimental intervention. And you might use some qualitative procedures, for example, to create a new instrument or to identify which variables, which measures would be important to use in this experiment, how to measure dependent variables, or what kind of personality variables might actually predict the outcomes, and so on. Another possibility is you can actually collect some qualitative data right within your experimental study. For example, you can conduct some post-experimental interviews with participants to find out how they felt, how they experienced your procedure, what strategies they used, why did they decide to act in a certain way or other in your experiment, or whether they followed the instructions or maybe they guessed the hypothesis. So you can use this data collected right within this experimental procedure and analyze it to enrich your quantitative findings and to control your quantitative findings as well, because maybe some participants need to be excluded. Or after you conduct your experimental study and you obtain some results, maybe these results are a bit surprising, you might actually go and collect some more qualitative data to understand actually why did those results occur, or why were there individual differences at the level of results, what could explain it, and so on. So even in very positivist-minded experimental studies, actually qualitative series can be important contributions. And a final question that we often ask ourselves is how to describe this design. And Creswell and colleagues propose a notation for describing mixed method designs. If you have a paradigm that is dominant with respect to another, for example, you are doing mainly a quantitative study, but you also include a qualitative component, you can use uppercase letters and lowercase letters to reflect which strategy is dominant. Then if you do this study within one series, you can use a plus sign to show that you actually combine the results in a single round of analysis and interpretation. Or if you go sequentially, you can use a little arrow to show that you started, for example, with a qualitative series, which is more important for you, and then you use this to test an additional quantitative hypothesis. Or embedding of qualitative data, for example, within quantitative, you can show with this parenthesis, like here. Recursive is when actually you do probably several series and you turn from qualitative data to quantitative and vice versa. Or you collect this data in parallel and you use one set of results to inform the other. And so on. So you can use this kind of notation to write down your own research design. Well, let's now turn to some examples just to get an idea of how it all works. Convergent designs, when we merge the data from two series. This is often the case in psychology, for example, when we combine closed questions and open-ended questions in a questionnaire, and then we can analyze them together. Or in a qualitative study, we can incorporate some psychometric tests to get more information about our participants. Or in an experiment, we can also collect some qualitative data to better understand why people acted in a certain way or other. One example of a convergent study comes from our paper with Ilona Boniman and Charles Martinez, Teaching Happiness at School. And it was a study where we aimed to validate a new program which aims to improve well-being of children at school. And in this study, this program was implemented in one school. Another school was a control school. And in this experimental school, there was a pre-test and a post-test in September and in June, respectively. So essentially, it was a very classical research design with a non-equivalent control group, non-randomized because it was from a different school. But it was also complemented by a qualitative series. Because after the end of at the end of the school year, Charles went and conducted interviews with 4 students, 2 teachers, and the principal of the intervention school. And those interviews actually aimed to get more information, to get a better understanding of the context. How did the children experience those well-being lessons? How did the teachers feel about teaching those lessons? What did they find valuable? Or maybe what barriers, what kind of difficulties they experienced? And how did the children respond to this from the perspective of children themselves, from the perspective of the teachers, and from the principal's point of view? And basically, based on those 7 interviews, it was not such a huge study. We performed thematic analysis based on the work of Brown and Clark, and we managed to identify some themes that describe the outcomes of this course. What did the children learn about? Explicit learning, the psychological outcomes, what kind of personality changes they have experienced, and the theme of challenges, basically what are the difficulties during the implementing of this course. And this is a convergent study because even though qualitative data was collected after the quantitative series, but the data were analyzed all together, and these studies were not kind of split in the results of quantitative study were not used to inform qualitative data collection. So in this sense, these results were analyzed in parallel and just connected because they complemented one another. So that's why it's merging. Sequential mixed method studies are a situation when we use qualitative methods, for example, to inform our test development procedures, or maybe we do a qualitative interview study in order to formulate some specific hypothesis that we later may want to test in a quantitative study. Or we might do a quantitative study to screen out some participants or to identify participants with particular score profiles that we want to interview because we are interested in particular personality characteristics. So this would be essentially sequential examples of a sequential strategy. And of course, in psychology, there are plenty of data collection procedures where we collect quantitative and qualitative data in parallel. Especially this is often the case in psychology of motivation. For example, when you do some kind of repertoire grids, or you analyze motivational content using some kind of personal strivings package by Robert Emmons, or you use personal project methodology. It's all a situation when a person generates their own strivings. For example, in the personal strivings package by Emmons, a person is asked to formulate I usually try to, and the participant is given 15 unfinished sentences, which are all the same. I usually try to, and I usually try to be nice with other people. I usually try to succeed well at school, and so on. So they formulate their motivational content, their strivings. And then these strivings can be analyzed qualitatively using some kind of content analysis procedures to code the content, and also quantitatively because those strivings are used to obtain evaluations. For example, do they conflict with one another, or how easy are they to achieve, and so on. So there is a combination of quantitative and qualitative analysis. Another example is the ultimate meanings technique by Dmitry Leontiev, when you actually ask a person a question, why do people do something? For example, why do people eat? And the person gives you an answer, well, maybe we eat to recover our energy, or maybe we eat to enjoy the food. And then you're supposed to ask the same question with respect to each of those motives. And why do we need to recover our energy? And then a person gives you some kind of answer. And essentially you go up this tree of meanings until you reach a meaning where a person is unable to give you a final answer. And as a result, you come up with a tree of meanings which describes the motivational structure of a person. For example, why do people do something? And the person says to relax. And then up this tree, and finally the final meaning to merge with the universe. And when you analyze this, you can calculate some quantitative characteristics of this tree, how many nodes are there, what is its structure, but also you can interpret it qualitatively from the point of content and from the point of just structure. Is it connected? Is it integrated? Or maybe there are different motivational systems. For example, when people have an alcohol addiction, Dmitry Leontiev discovered that there are different systems of motivation that don't often have a connection with one another. So this is just an example of a methodology where both kind of data are collected within one series. And there are such procedures in psychology. So we have explored a little bit some mixed methods research designs, and I hope you have now more or less an idea of how it all works.